Well, you know, I brought the Quran, and just footnoted here with these little post-it marks is the 8 places where there's some reference to hijab. And as you probably know, the word hijab does not mean headscarf in any one of those references. It means separation. It means a spiritual divide between us and the heavens. But then what I have here are book after book after book put forward by the government of Saudi Arabia, political movements, institutions, each one of them telling us women's dress, hijab in Islam, and scarf styling. You know, how the many different designs that you can have for the scarf. What I see in all of this is a translation, a selling of this word hijab to mean Islamically a lot of very troubling ideas. One of them, for example, here says that, relates a hadith where they then say that there will be 2 types of people in the fires of hell, and one of them will be women, especially the women who do not cover and dress properly. So all women and all people should have choice. But what's happened in my lifetime over these past 40 years is that an institution of political Islam that's called Islamism has made the headscarf a symbol of its movement. And so from Jamaat Islami in Pakistan to the Muslim Brotherhood to the government of Saudi Arabia to Yusuf Qaradawi in Qatar, they have made it so that to be a good Muslim woman, you must wear the headscarf. And of course, this doesn't reflect at all everybody's choice. But what I think is really critical to do is we always have to follow the money. We have to follow the persuasive arguments. We have to follow the publishing houses that are doing all of this. And the ultimate impact for me about all of this is the millions of women who do not have choice. So 1979, the government of Iran made it mandatory that women cover. We know what happens in Saudi Arabia. We know what's happening in Sudan now. We know what's happening in so many corners of the world. And that is what has serious impact for me, because the impact is not just about that piece of clothing that you're wearing. It's then about your access to education, to healthcare, to jobs, to all of these other issues that make women then restricted in their citizenship. Our topic is clothing and politics. And for me, the headscarf has become this symbol that has sadly taken away from women in so many communities, from Indonesia to the United States, their full citizenship in society. 2 out of 3 mosques in America, as you know, force women to pray behind a separate area, because the assumption is the same one that's put forward for why a woman has to cover her hair, that we're too sexy for our hair, we're too sexy for our butts, we're too sexy for our voice. And so for me, that has a serious, serious impact. And we as a society have decided that it's not okay. Brigham Young University right now, as many of you might have heard, is now sending women who have sexual assault cases to their honor code investigation office. We've decided as a society that women do not have the burden of honor on their shoulders. But for me, the really fundamental ethical problem with the assumption of the headscarf is that we're too sexy for our hair, and the men in this room will become so sexually aroused by seeing my hair that then they won't be able to resist themselves. And I don't have that responsibility.
So that's interesting that you bring that up, and you bring up this relationship between hijab and men. What do you think the relationship is between hijab and men versus, hijab and faith? And I want both of you guys to answer that.
It's not as important what I believe, it's what is taught. From schools in suburbs of Chicago here to Delaware, girls are taught at a very young age that they have to cover in order to be chaste, pious, and modest.
So Huda, you were in Oklahoma, you lived in the suburbs. Have you seen that?
I've never heard that once in my life.
Well, I can give you book after book.
And I'm sure we can have book after book after so many different ideologies, but that doesn't mean that that's what the majority of women are reading. None of my friends are like that. I'm not like that. I follow so many other, I'm a fashion blogger. I follow so many other hijabi fashion bloggers that aren't like that. People should have the right to choose, and that's what I'm talking about. I mean, it's not that, just as I'm also opposed to France banning the headscarf, that's also taking away women's rights. And if we're caring about women's rights, we should let women interpret the religion or their own personal preferences in the way that they want. And we're giving women that choice and not saying that, no, I think this person, or I picked up a book that said this, and therefore I'm going to try to make sure to vilify Muslim women who constantly are wearing the headscarf.
So I think this tactic of trying to assume that there's a vilification going on is exactly...
I don't think it's a tactic because actually just last month you went to the Department of Homeland Security and said that the hijab is, quote, on... I wrote it down.
I didn't go to the Department of Homeland Security.
On the conveyor belt of radicalization, you are constantly working for increased surveillance of people who look like me. This is not a conversation. This is someone who is vilifying my choice to wear the headscarf.
And so let me just make a simple point, which is I didn't go to the Department of Homeland Security, so I guess you misspoke just that I
guess the video that had their logo in the end also misspoke.
What I will point out is that what we are overlooking then is exactly a dynamic in which we don't want to have this conversation. Because what happens is if you actually talk about the fact that Boko Haram kidnaps hundreds of girls and then immediately puts headscarves on them because that's their ideology.
I'm against Boko Haram.
What are we supposed to do? Ignore the fact that that's actually a tactic of this political Islamic movement? What does ISIS do the minute it gets its Yazidi girls as sex slaves? It immediately puts headscarves on them because they believe this assumption that these women are too sexy for their hair.
Do you believe ISIS is representative of Islam?
Do I think what?
ISIS is representative of Islam?
ISIS is the Islamic State, and they are practicing the teachings.
They do not represent me.
Fine, that's great. I'm so glad because they don't represent me either, but they do represent their interpretation of Islam. And if we refuse to acknowledge that and continue to bury our heads in the sand, then we're going to continue to inflame this mistrust that I think leads to some of the distrust that you end up feeling.
It's not distrust, it's constant vilification.
Well, I feel it right now.
And I've seen it, and I've read it, and I've seen it.
I feel it very much from you right now in terms of this inability to have this conversation because what you have done is vilified my assessment of these very much issues. I mean, last week, what did you tweet out, Huda? Shit's gonna go down here at this
It's gone down.
Yeah.
So I'm actually...
So what did that mean? Why does a conversation about the headscarf have to become this really difficult conversation? Because we don't want to touch these issues because they are too close to our identities. But if we don't, in any society, then we are never going to progress. We are never going to tackle these difficult topics.
So I'm going to move on to common ground.
Could I just respond to that real quickly?
Go ahead.
Thank you. So again, I'm just going to say that, so I'm a hijabi Iranian fashion blogger, and I actually constantly talk about these issues because it's important, again, as I mentioned, that the media is constantly misrepresenting us. If I didn't want to have this conversation, I would not be here. I'm here because...
Both of you identify as Muslim feminists, though you both have different views on a number of topics. How does hijab inform that facet of your identity?
I believe that being an Islamic feminist means that we fight for equal rights. So what that means is that today we fight for the right of women to have equal inheritance to their brothers. We fight for the right for women to have equal witness. And we fight for equal responsibility in society. So that means that a woman does not carry the burden of honor in society. She is not the burden of chastity. She is not the burden of piety. So what that means is that when I go into a mosque, I shouldn't have to go pray in a basement because I am a sexual temptation to the men and I'm going to ruin their spiritual state. But that is the progression of what happens with this concept of the headscarf and the hijab. Everybody can define it as they wish, but the implications for us in society are very damning and very damaging. And to romanticize the headscarf, to me, is a very dangerous point. To make it a fetish in fashion blogging and fashion industry with Dolce & Gabbana putting out new abayas is very dangerous on what the headscarf represents. To me, it represents this purity culture. It's not just the stuff of one book or two books, it's the stuff of laws. It's the stuff of criminalization in communities across the Muslim world. It's the stuff of regulation. If one person does not feel it as their motivation, that doesn't mean it's not a reality.